Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, COP26, the parents' revolt in Virginia, and the cancellation of Terry Gilliam. So COP26 kicked off at the weekend. The world leaders have been in Glasgow this week trying to agree a framework for reducing carbon emissions and potentially limiting climate change. Tom, should we start at the beginning? There's been a lot of commentary on how our leaders got there, so to speak.
Well, hypocrisy always abounds at these climate conferences. Of course, there was a lot of discussion about the fleets of private jets delivering all of the world leaders there to intone piously about climate change, in the process kind of emitting more carbon than a lot of people probably muster in a lifetime. Joe Biden's 85-car motorcade that was ferrying him around Rome and then into the UK. And a lot of discussion also about how the sponsors, I think, of COP26 had contributed a huge amount to climate change and all the rest of it. Now, it's not to say in pointing out this hypocrisy that everyone should live as miserable a life as they want to impose on everyone else. But the reason I think it's significant is because of the fact that it lets slip the fact that we all know, which is that the costs of eco-austerity will not be borne evenly. We all know this. Even in terms of the people who will either be able to kind of muster some kind of excuse or exemption to these kinds of restrictions, through to the people who will be able to pay the kind of exorbitant taxes or whatever that will try and price people out of flying or any other kind of activity, or just would be able to, do some sort of silly gesture like getting a bunch of trees planted to offset their private jet flights. I think Elton John did on behalf of Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
And that's why the reason the hypocrisy is important, I think, is because not only is this spectacle, this kind of decadent spectacle of excess, really embarrassing for a bunch of people who are trying to preach a much more kind of austere lifestyle really for the rest of us, but it just completely explodes the idea that with climate change we're all in it together. We all know who the winners and losers are going to be if we accept the kind of punishing policies that are being pushed at places like COP26, not obviously embraced on the whole, because, national interests and domestic interests always play a role, and often the pledges don't meet the ambition such as it is. But I think that's why the hypocrisy matters so much. Definitely just demonstrates that fact that we all know, but is often not said explicitly.
Yeah. Ella, what have you made of it?
There's also so much of the commentary has been so kind of brazenly superficial.
Yeah.
People getting genuinely upset about the fact that Boris Johnson fell asleep, or that he did, or seemed to fall asleep, or that he didn't wear a mask. The worst thing that he did was that he didn't wear a mask sat next to David Attenborough. It was all about the messaging and the kind of image of the conference. Indeed, actually worse than Boris Johnson flying back early to and leaving COP26 was the papers picked up the fact that he flew back early to meet a climate denier like Charles Moore. So it's like if he'd flown back early for a private lunch at the Garrett Club with Greta Thunberg, it would have probably been fine.
I don't think he should be let in.
Because he went to superficial, because he went to someone who, by the way, isn't a climate denier, just questions the word emergency in all of this. That's the important thing. And one of the biggest fusses over the last few days has been the menu of COP26, which it has haggis and venison on it, as you say, Tom. They should really be feasting on crickets and soya and whatever to set an example.
At the FT's events, I'm sure they're serving all that good stuff.
But is that really all this has to offer? And with all the resources poured into it, all the money in the room at COP26, all the brains, all the science in the room, and all you can come up with is this. Indeed, we've discussed on this podcast previously that it's now, technical solutions, important tech in terms of the tech of creating better and cheaper and more sustainable energy is now comes second to doing this kind of superficial gesture politics. So the fact, even, would we really care if they got a train or a plane up there? As long as they were actually if they were coming up, that conference came up with some serious innovation into how to make the world a greener and more plentiful place. But you wouldn't care about that. But the fact is, there's still the only real thing that's come out of COP26 is, a bunch of us are going to stop using coal. We knew that already. There's been nothing new come out of it apart from this sort of snide sniping about people's personal preferences or whether or not Boris Johnson stayed awake. I mean, to be fair to him, didn't he say we're like, people have been joking it's 5 minutes to midnight or whatever. I'm sure he's tired. But if that's the level this is at, how are any of us supposed to take it seriously?
Yeah, it's a good point on the pledges. They've talked about ending deforestation when the world is already greening and getting more forests. They've talked about stopping using coal when most countries, signed up to that, are really not using much coal anymore. The key coal, users like China didn't sign up to that particular pledge.
Or the US.
Or the US even. I mean, you mentioned the crickets, and that seems to be a particular obsession of the media. The Financial Times, The Economist, and Sky News were pushing out this idea, which is unusual for a broadcaster because they're not supposed to put forward opinions normally. Tom, what have you made of the way the media has covered this? Because it seems as if there's not really any room for debate, or that they're in fact sort of advocating for what is happening at the conference, really.
You do see that slippage where climate change is concerned. So as you say, you had Sky News, which has really embraced the whole kind of climate agenda. I think they have a daily climate show. Now you see them putting out discussion topics like, is it too late to solve the climate emergency or crisis? And how loaded that is just seems to completely escape them. Similarly, I think if we're talking about people who should kind of try and stay out of politics, although in his case never does, Prince Charles and his interventions. So he spoke at the opening ceremony and talking about the need for the private sector to come in and to sort this out, hailed from the podium by Boris Johnson as a visionary on these issues, given he's always been of a kind of slightly neo-feudalistic bent, Prince Charles. And again, I think it's because people act as if the climate issue is just as simple as being concerned about, again, just sort of protecting from weather events, or it's really depoliticized, when we all know that there's a politics at play. I mean, you can take, even if you want to take as read what certain people are making claims about in relation to the climate, how you respond to it is entirely in the realm of politics, or at least it should be. I think the problem is that our public discussion about it and our media discussion about it is so incredibly limited. There's a kind of predetermined set of policies, more or less. And if you want to reframe the question about should we prioritise the climate or should we prioritise people's living standards? I mean, that just isn't allowed. That's just been even suggesting that, maybe acting in the way that people are suggesting would be hasty and damaging. You get slapped with this idea that if you're not a climate denier, you're a climate delayer, and that's almost as bad. It becomes this really slippery sort of censorious discussion. And that's one thing that's really difficult to break through, because really what we're talking about here and what we spend most of our time criticising is we're not necessarily talking about climate science so much as we're talking about the politics of environmentalism, the fact that the answer to the question for these people is always that we have to have less. Now, a lot of the world leaders, Boris Johnson in particular, really want to kind of suggest that it isn't this zero-sum game that, all of this shiny green technology is going to ride to the rescue. But we all know that's not the case. Yeah. I mean, his own climate committee, the Climate Change Committee, which advises the government, have chided him for relying too much on, hoped for in the future developments in, carbon capture and storage and all the rest of it, things which just haven't proven themselves just yet. So I think that's the problem, is that the debate, and you see it in the media and you see it in general, is just so limited. And again, the policy prescriptions are so just predetermined that people almost don't realise that they're making quite political statements when they should, in the case of the media, certainly be a lot more objective and unbiased in the way that they talk about these things.
Definitely. I mean, we've talked a lot on this podcast about some of the costs of the kind of net zero transition for a country like the UK, but it's become, given that this is a global summit, we should probably talk a bit about what it means for the developing world. And it's quite clear that, India has signed up to this 2070 pledge, which is, net zero in 50 years' time, effectively. No one who's signed up, Modi's not going to be alive by the time that comes around. India's been chastised for this. Russia, China are being chastised. President Xi is not at the meeting at all. President Putin isn't either. I mean, what do we make of that dynamic? Because there's something a little bit unseemly about that.
Yeah, I mean, unseemly is a polite way of putting it. I mean, you now have a discussion about, have a situation in which big Western players are deciding the fate of, Russia's not a small country, but, developing nations which have no necessarily political power. There's a kind of discussion in particular about this sort of the beauty of countries in Africa and the way in which people live there, and how it's, you have people, Greta Thunberg and others talking about the Industrial Revolution as this horrendous period in history, and that how we've all kind of fallen into disrepute in the UK and in other Western nations, and and basically all of that is like, it's like the noble savage. It's like it's an incredibly colonial way of discussing the developing world. And it also is like a kind of almost wearing Western supremacy as a badge of honor. It's like, because we are in a position historically to be able to make these decisions, we will now decide your fate. I mean, we've mentioned several times on this podcast the issue of democracy, and how in particular things like COP26 is a perfect example. It's like the most undemocratic thing to take place, where you can't get in if you're an ordinary punter, and it's being held in Glasgow amid all these strikes and stuff, and it's like glaring in your face, the undemocratic nature of it. But the global discussion about democracy, I mean, why is it that Boris Johnson or Joe Biden or Angela Merkel or any of these big political players would get to decide the fate of someone living in a village in Nairobi, or indeed living somewhere in Pakistan? I mean, it's incredibly unfair, and it's what everyone who in other discussions about Western imperialism talks about in this superficial way. This is what it looks like in the 21st century.
I mean, the India example as well just really rounds that home. You've got a lot of people expressing regret that an Indian prime minister has failed to meet the demands of a British prime minister to reach net zero in a timely fashion. And Rob Lyons wrote about the so-called kind of climate bad boys on Spike this week, so particularly China and India as well as others. And he just makes the point that obviously China and India have made a lot of economic strides in recent years, much of it powered by fossil fuels, obviously. But what Rob did was he looked at the GDP per capita, and even despite all of this progress, it's like 19,000 for China, and it's about 7,000 for India, UK and US, it's like 47 and 68 respectively. Like, they've still got a hell of a long way to go in order to enjoy the sorts of living standards that we've taken for granted in the West for a very long time. So to get into this really unseemly neo-colonial, as you say, sort of spectacle of just kind of admonishing them for daring to try to meet the aspirations and needs of their own people, as much as those two countries have their problems, it's really unpleasant, definitely.
And they're trying to do it in the way that we did it. And we're saying that's not acceptable now. You're watching the Spiked podcast. While you're here, you should subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so you never miss a video. But even better, to keep up with all of Spike's content, all of our brilliant articles and essays that we publish every weekday, you should sign up to our newsletter, Today on Spiked. Every weekday, you'll get a roundup of all of Spike's content, plus some exclusive commentary. To sign up, just go to spiked-online.com/newsletters and click Today on Spiked. That's spiked-online.com/newsletters and Today on Spiked. Now, back to the Spiked podcast. Let's move on to events in America. There was a huge upset in Virginia over the race to become governor. The Republican Glenn Youngkin won a surprise victory in a state, essentially, that Joe Biden won comfortably only a year ago in the presidential election. He won by 10 points. And the main focus of Youngkin's campaign was education, which is an unusual thing to focus on in any kind of political race, really. It's not normally a big, hot election topic. But Tom, do you want to explain why education was so central to this?
So it's become the first kind of electoral test, albeit a kind of statewide electoral test of this battle that's been going on between this kind of nascent parents movement and various school boards. And the issue is basically the way in which kind of woke politics has started to kind of permeate school practice. It's a kind of combination of things. So a lot of these places, the lockdowns meant that kids were at school for, most of the past year in some cases. And so you have this situation where school is brought home and a lot of parents were seeing the kinds of materials that their kids were having put in front of them and seeing some of these kind of Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo type tropes make their way in to the curriculum, and not in a way, it seems like, that was just about discussing these ideas amongst others, but this, this being something akin to sort of indoctrinating kids into all of these ideas around America being white supremacist, or around the general kind of what, as a catch-all term, kind of gets referred to as critical race theory, but it's probably even more sort of degraded and certainly a lot more widespread than that particular quite niche legal academic pursuit. And also, particularly in Virginia, there's been this new discussion around kind of gender-neutral bathrooms, which has stirred up, and we've talked about in Spites in the past week. So you had Glenn Youngkin very effectively make that a kind of core part of his campaign, and then Terry McAuliffe completely shoot himself in the foot, first of all, by saying that this issue of critical race theory in schools was basically a right-wing conspiracy theory and a racist dog whistle, I think in his particular terms. There was this quote which really did the rounds in one of the debates where he basically suggested that parents basically dictating what should be taught in school is something that he doesn't want to see. It was actually in the context of something a little bit different, but nevertheless it came to define that kind of core difference between him and Youngkin, I guess. And also the media, it's been fascinating because they have just completely done basically two things at the same time. On the one hand, has just admonished these parents and suggested that they basically are either just racist or they're just gripped by a conspiracy theory that doesn't actually exist. And then this other thing, which is to say that, critical race theory just isn't the thing. This is a complete myth. This is completely made up. Again, McAuliffe made this point despite the fact when he was last governor in Virginia, his own Department of Education instructed schools to quote unquote embrace critical race theory. This is something that Christopher Rufo found out in the course of the recent weeks of campaigning. And so what you see here is something that I think we're going to see more and more, is that wokeness just cannot survive democracy. As soon as you have an opportunity in which the issues are live and in which the election is really polarized those subjects, you see a genuine pushback. As you say, Joe Biden won this state comfortably. Now it's gone to a Republican, I think, for the first time in about 12 years. Yeah. So it's really, really significant. And what's amazing is that not unlike the meltdown after Trump's election or various other elections that haven't gone the kind of Democratic establishment's way in recent years, you just have outright denial that this is a problem, smearing it all as just racism, despite the fact that you see in reports that there's many Black and Hispanic parents who are really concerned about this as well. So it's just shows that the Democrats have a real problem where this kind of thing is concerned, because not only are they not on the side of a lot of ordinary people on these questions, but as soon as they receive that admonishment from the voters, again, the reflex is to say, you're wrong and you're probably racist. Yeah. And that playbook hasn't worked very well for them in recent years.
I like your point, Tom, about wokeness not surviving contact with democracy. And in some ways, you get a sense that the people pushing many of these woke ideas kind of know that. I mean, a lot of this is done in a way that is designed to bypass parents quite clearly, pushing these ideas through schools rather than having a kind of open debate about them. But also the evasion, whenever parents complain about this, the evasion itself shows that they're not prepared to defend the ideas around that have been called critical race theory in public. They simply say, no, we're not teaching that. Or either that or, oh no, we're just teaching about racism or about race and about racism in history or something like that. So there is a kind of, there is almost, knowingly or not, there is a sense in which wokeness, the advocates of it sort of know they can't really get away with it, or they know they're not on the side of the majority.
Yeah, or as you said in your column this week, Fraser, they're kind of playing this double game, which is there was this brilliant write-up in brilliantly terrible write-up in a Guardian US article where he was basically framing Youngkin's win as the weaponizing of an anti-CRT sentiment, and the article talked about the fact that this was really just a backlash to the Black Lives Matters protest, as if like you said, it was a really specific campaign about education and about teaching kids. This wasn't just like a nebulous feeling, sentiment that he picked up on in general society. It was a very specific and targeted area of policy and area of politics in relation to what happens with kids in schools. And the article went on to talk about the fact that this was really just about, a backlash to more minorities being visible in America. Yeah. And that's on the one, like you say in your article, on the one hand, they say critical race theory is really specific. It's it's not being taught everywhere. It's a theory. And then on the other hand, the article said, well, they're lumping things like anti-bias training in with this. It's like, that is critical race theory. Yeah. That's if you're talking to kids about race, that's great. That's fine. People have been doing that for years, actually, and schools have been pretty good about that. That's why we don't ban Harper Lee or To Kill a Mockingbird. It's why we teach Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain because we've talked to kids about the issues of race. That's very different from saying, and what Youngkin picked up on, that there are areas of education which are no-go zones.
Yeah.
So you cannot deny your white privilege, or you cannot question whether or not there's a difference between you and your black friend and your white friend. But the thing is, this isn't just actually about education, because really what this whole discussion, and that, you know, Republicans can get a bit silly and can do the whole kind of like they're indoctrinating our kids thing. But the thing about this particular issue of critical race theory is that it does seem like a very obvious, if not indoctrination, willful kind of blinkering of kids to wider discussions about politics. And you see it play out outside of the classroom, in universities, and then now in workplaces where you have all of this training being brought in, and it gets people's backs up, because basically what it's saying is, if you don't buy into our position, you are a bigot and a racist. And so then that's not a backlash. That's a very normal position to have in a world that is a lot of the time seeming like it's going mad.
And it's interesting to hear Youngkin defending his campaign against critical race theory using the Martin Luther King line, essentially, which would be our defense, you know, which would be how we would argue against it as well, that we don't want to see the world through race.
Yeah.
But now if you refuse to see the world through race, then you're seen as part of the problem.
Well, that's what's so fascinating, because people are trying to present this almost as like some sort of really dirty, low, old-fashioned kind of racist Republican campaign in which you race bait and use this as an issue. People are trying to kind of like conjure up that kind of caricature. The boot is entirely on the other foot, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to this stuff. These people are defending, even though they're kind of sometimes pretending that it doesn't actually exist, a sort of practice and a sort of ideology, which again is being pushed uncritically in certain sectors. And there's many people, Chris Rufo as one of the most prominent among them, have exposed actual examples of this, which encourages kids as young as like kindergarten to think racially, to think of themselves as divided up as kind of irredeemably separate groups with different interests set against each other. It's a historical stain that will never go away. I mean, if anything's reviving racial thinking in America at the moment, and doing so with the nod and approval of the establishment, it's not this parents' movement. Yeah. It's the people that they're railing against, definitely.
Well, the parents' movement have been essentially, people have called for them to be treated as domestic terrorists.
which seems to be the sort of democratic establishment's answer to everything. It's to label them domestic terrorists.
Yes, exactly.
It's also just in more broadly discussions about how, racism in society versus in the classroom. The thing that was so terrible about that Channel 4 program, the school that ended racism.
Oh yeah, this is about the British example of the school implementing critical race theory.
Similar discussions in America, is the idea that, as you say, that this stain of history follows children from birth right up and that's kind of inescapable. But the whole thing that was my favorite film East is East is the play out of it now, and it's all back in the news. Then that really successfully looked at the way in which that generationally things change. So actually, even if there is racism in your home, if your parents have a certain view, or if your parents have suffered from racism, when you come into school and you're with young, fresh, innocent kids who are of all different backgrounds, but you're all on an even keel because you haven't had a life and you haven't had experiences. You're new to the world, and you then develop different perspectives to your parents. I mean, that's what has happened culturally. That's what generational shift is about. You don't just kind of live and breathe the values of your home, or even the values of society. You find your own views, and you can only do that if you embrace the idea that kids are blank sheets, that don't come with any preconceived ideas. And the problem with critical race theory and all this obsession with race is that it pretends like kids are already loaded with all this stuff, and what you've got to do is kind of force it out of them. And actually what's happening, as you say, is the opposite. The boot's on the other foot. It's like, instead of embracing the fact that kids are open to everything, and that as a teacher you're meant to be able to shape them in some kind of way, or at least give them the tools to shape themselves, it's now like you've got these horrible things that you have to moralize, and it's like a dirty sponge that you have to clean. And that's a really dystopian way and that's why the parents are reacting. It's like, my kid is not a racist. That's a terrible thing to say about a kid. Don't say that. And so it's a very basic gut instinct that this is wrong.
Just white fragility. But even on the basis of kids. But it's probably also worth just saying, finally, on the Virginia election, the fact that at the very same time that you had all these commentators saying this was another example of white lash, this is white supremacy and all the rest of it, the Lieutenant Governor who was elected, a Republican, Winston Sears, a black American woman of Jamaican extraction originally, a curious beneficiary of white supremacy, it seems like. So I think that really, again, gives you an indication of how full of it these people are, to be frank.
And finally, let's talk about Terry Gilliam, his play that he's directing, Into the Woods, supposed to be at the Old Vic, but it's been cancelled. And allegedly, this is because the staff at the Old Vic were upset about Gilliam's comments on trans, on diversity, and on Me Too. What do we make of this? I mean, it seems like another arts worker staff revolt against mild opinions, essentially.
Well, that's what it feels like. Like, as you say, there was this report in the Stage website which suggested that this unrest from staff led to this being canned. I mean, this was a pretty big production by all accounts, from what I can tell. It was at the Old Vic. Apparently, they'd already sold thousands of tickets. Stephen Sondheim had approved of what Terry Gilliam wanted to do with the performance. But because of this disquiet, and as you say, Terry Gilliam has expressed these views in a slightly blunt fashion, but these are not beyond the pale things to say. I mean, on Me Too, he said that whilst he hated Harvey Weinstein, he felt that it turned into a bit of a witch hunt and perfectly decent people were getting caught up in it. Again, he's kind of taken a pop at the idea of white privilege and kind of gender self-ID. He told an interviewer for The Independent, who was clearly very unimpressed by the write-up, that, he's transitioning to being a black feminist, a black lesbian or something like this. It's a kind of, just a blunt joke sending up the whole idea of self-identification. Apart from maybe the way in which they're expressed, these are things that a lot of people think, and yet there's no space for even the presence of this man in this particular institution. And as you say, we've seen this with the Netflix walkout recently. We saw it at Hachette last year. The publishers of a new J.K. Rowling book, with the staff were threatening to down tools over it. Jordan Peterson's publisher, they had this in Canada, they had this big kind of teary town hall meeting because they were so upset that they were publishing this slightly kooky self-help guru's latest book. And it's an increasing trend. And one of the things I think is interesting about it is that you're starting to see companies capitulate to it more, even in a situation where you would assume that the kind of economics were such that they would lean towards just sticking to their guns. But as we saw with the Netflix walkout, where Ted Sarandos, I think his name is, the kind of chief executive, originally stood by Dave Chappelle and then started to kind of soften a little bit. Here we have a situation where they've just completely capitulated. I mean, they brought Gilliam in and his co-director in for a meeting to talk about the culture and values of the institution, and then basically decided that it shouldn't go ahead. So it's an interesting case, I think, and probably a sign of more things to come, is that, these staff revolts really can chalk up some successes over, as it's worth stressing, pretty mild opinions expressed by the person in the crosshairs in that respect.
I mean, Ella, the theatre historically has been a place where you can be probably more provocative than you can be in film and television. Something that escapes the censors of the government, at least since the 1960s and 70s in this country. What are we to make of this? That actually these are normal opinions that are now beyond the pale.
But the thing is, it's even if they weren't normal opinions, even if he actually had gone full transphobe and had said that Harvey Weinstein was his best mate and that, he didn't care that women were being groped or something, even if he had his own personal moral beliefs were completely unaligned with a normal society, like, artists and art and people who create art are weird, and they often have weird and out there views, and we know that. I mean, you could sit here and list from Picasso to Althusser to lots of people who had, extremely immoral views and had
and behaved immorally as well,
and were way outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, but they were fantastic artists. And that, I think that whole kind of division between the art and the artists, people talk about it a lot, but we would rarely talk about how important it is to be able to make that distinction between who a person is and what they produce. And if this was, we would defend his right to put it on, even if it was a play all about Me Too. But the fact that it wasn't, but that this is a production that has nothing to do really with, definitely nothing to do with his views on Me Too or on self-ID, tells you that there's something else going on here. And, it's also just the hypocrisy of it makes me sick, because that in these institutions, they have been working with individuals, as it happens, posh men for many, many years who are like incorrigible assholes. People in theatre tend to be unpleasant. They don't treat the stagehands well. You know, it's like a trope. But when
allegedly,
but I mean, okay, I'm not naming names.
No names.
Even when I was in sort of Amdram at university, you know, everyone's an asshole. But when it comes to something like this, when it comes to fashionable things like gender, self-ID or feminism, which as it happens are important political issues that, as we've said until we're blue on the face in this podcast, need to be discussed. It's not just flippant things. It's not just bad behavior. There are genuine political issues. Then there's no tolerance for it. I mean, if you are working in an institution, whether you're working at Netflix, whether you're working in a theatre, you do not get to decide what the punters watch unless you've been appointed as the chief critic or the moderator or the curator. If you're just the staff, you don't get to say what's put on the shelves at Tesco. Like, there is a genuine sense in which, how about audience choice here?
Yeah.
That's been thrown out of the window as well.
Yeah, completely. And Tom, what do you make of the, you know, Terry Gilliam, obviously most famous for being a member of Monty Python, Life of Brian, their most famous film, scandalised the church. Is this just the new church that he's scandalising now?
Well, it feels like that, definitely. I mean, what these staff members who have, you know, gone to the wall over this, what they're basically asking for is for all of the output of the old Vic to be subjected to a kind of woke purity test. And it's a woke purity test which isn't even about the work itself, as you're saying. It's just about the individuals. So utterly bizarre. I mean, when these things happen, there is sometimes an attempt to try and suggest that, you know, whether it's a Terry Gilliam or Dave Chappelle, these people are the ones with the power here.
Yeah.
You know, you've got these kind of rank and file members of the institution or the company who are, you know, striking a blow for not wanting their places to be an unsafe environment or a place in which trans people won't feel comfortable, all the rest of it. Aside from the kind of patronising elements to all of that and the weird suggestion that, you know, a lot of these people, like Dave Chappelle doesn't work in the Netflix offices. You know, it's an absurd suggestion that just by putting his stuff out there, that they're making people feel unsafe in any way, shape or form. But I think one thing that's worth pointing out is not only, as Ella was saying, is that they're effectively kind of, again, kind of denying choice to the audience or saying that they shouldn't be exposed to this kind of material, which is a wrong-headed position anyway. But also, they're playing a really dangerous game, because if you're basically empowering your employers to rule on what isn't and isn't acceptable to say and to think, and that goes right up to the top, so even a big bankable name like Terry Gilliam can be subject to this and cancelled as a consequence of that. You think that's not going to happen to a stagehand or someone like further down the pecking order? So that this attempt to present this as something actually kind of bottom up and sort of positive in that respect, I think is ridiculous, because you're just handing the power and moral authority to your employers to rule on what is and isn't acceptable to say and to sack people as a consequence, basically. And if it can happen to Terry Gilliam, it can definitely happen to you.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.